Hello, guys and gals and non-binary cows. I am very happy to be with you this afternoon to talk to you during our last class, which is very sad. I know for a lot of you really enjoyed this process, but I wanted to hopefully take a moment for y'all to really think about all that you've done for the last couple weeks and how much you've learned. And hopefully you've come out of this process loving Unreal as much as all of us instructors and mentors and TAs here do. It's really our goal with this whole process is that you're seeing the amazing things you can do with this engine and want to create some of your own awesome things. But today, I'm going to be finishing up and talking about post-processing and rendering, which is exciting because now is the time where you get to see the fruits of your labor. You're going to take out all the stuff that you've done in Unreal and make a movie out of it. And we're also going to dress up some of the lighting and some of the other things you've done within your scenes to make this really, really pop. So what we're going to look at first, just a quick overview. I'm going to show you a quick way to output a render out of Unreal. So if you really just have been wanting to see what your animations are looking like in a movie format without having to go through an extensive render process, I'm going to show you quickly how you can make that happen. We're also going to do some overviews of what post-processing is. Noah covered a little bit of it in the lighting class where he talked about a post-process volume. We're going to go a little bit more in depth with that today. So we'll talk about what post-processing is, what color grading is versus color management. We'll also look at OpenColor IO, what that is. And we'll also do a little bit more of a review of color grading and the color grading workflow. We'll also look at some lighting and the post-process volume itself. We're going to be covering some rendering in here as well, how you might render in layers, render in passes, what the render movie queue is, and also some render movie settings. So a lot to cover today, and let's just go ahead and get to it. So as I mentioned just a bit ago, well, first off, the project that you're going to be using for this is actually the same project that Noah was using. So if you still have that project open and want to just use that to follow along, that's the best thing to use. So you don't have to go to SmashCut to download the one that I included today. Noah's is more than fine to use. The only thing that I did add in here that you might want to download, and I downloaded it separately because it is a big project file, is it's a LUT zip file. So I included some LUTs for you that you can include in your project. So that would be the only thing I'd recommend downloading today if you'd like to follow along. So make sure you go check that out on SmashCut. All right, so a quick overview for outputting a render. So Unreal does have movie scene capture. It's a legacy version. So when something says legacy, it's something that was an older version and there's a newer version which is the movie render queue, and this might go away in future versions of Unreal, but it still is in Unreal, and I still like to use the movie scene capture for doing something like a play blast. So if you're a Maya user or you've used other DCCs to render out your animations or do quick play blasts so you can see your animations, that's kind of how I've been using this lately. So I'm going to show you where this is, how you can get access to it real quickly, so that we can render out a really quick movie or AVI file. So let's go ahead and crack open this engine. So this is that scene file I was mentioning. We're going to adjust the settings in here. So if it's over bright, it's on purpose. So if you're wanting to do render movie queue, you are going to need render sequence. You are going to need to get your level sequence or have a level sequence. I already have one in here, but I'll create a new one so you can all follow along with me here. And I do have a folder in here for lecture that just says level sequences. So we'll call this quick render for now. All right. So instead of just hitting the little render clapper here, which will open up the movie render queue, I'm going to hit the little 3 dots to the right. And that will allow me to switch to the movie scene capture. Okay, so it doesn't immediately open it, so I will have to then hit the clapper one more time, and now that will open up the render movie settings. So it does default to the output format here, which is just AVI, but it does have the options for you to do MOVs if you prefer, if you're a Mac user. Also do render passes in here or different image sequences. So you still can output sequences with this. But for now, I know y'all are probably anxious to get your animations out of Unreal and see what it looks like. So doing an AVI would be more than fine. If you have some audio, you can also choose your audio format in here and have a default frame rate. I don't have anything going on in here yet, so I'm going to go ahead and just create a real quick camera. just so I can have something to output. And I will change my settings down here to just make this really short. So I don't want y'all to have to wait too long. And I can animate my camera real quickly here. I'll move this off to the side. So I will just do a quick push in with my camera, set a keyframe, and just move it forward to just have some animation happening. There we go. And then set the key. So now it'll just kind of quickly push in, real nice and easy. So this is I have going at 30 frames per second. This is set to 30 as well, but you can change to a custom frame rate if you'd like to, just by clicking on that checkbox, and then you can choose whatever frame rates you're wanting to output at. But I'll leave it at 30 for now. Also important to recognize your resolution. Mine is at 1280 by 720. Because this is a play blast, this is not something that I'm wanting to be final. I'm calling it a play blast, but because it's a quick movie, essentially is what I'm trying to make here. I don't need to render it at full resolution because I'm not too concerned about the lighting. I'm mostly concerned about the animation. So you can render it at smaller resolutions, but you definitely want to make sure that you're rendering it like at 16 by 9 or something similar. So I'll leave it at 1280 by 720. You can use some compression here to make it a little bit faster to render, and you can lower the quality. It does default to 75. I was fiddling around with it earlier, so it got cranked up to 100, but I'll leave it at 75. And you want to make sure you can choose where you're going to save it to. So this is going to go into saved animated videos folder within my project file. All right. So everything else I'm going to leave default. So cinematic mode, also engine scalability. You can turn this off if it's going to take a while to render. Mainly because when it goes to engine scalability, it's going to max out the quality of this render to cinematic for the engine scalability. But again, that's not what we're really looking for here. We're just trying to get something that's nice and quick. So also down here under animation, you can choose a custom start frame and end frame, and a set start frame and end frames here. So I can turn these on. So if I really only wanted to get a certain section of my animation, I can do that in here as well. All right, so with all of this set, if I just hit capture movie, I got to make sure I save what I got going on here. And it opened in my other window, unfortunately. Sorry about that. But it did. I lost my mouse. Give me a moment. Uh-oh. There you go. I think I'm back with you. Everyone can confirm they can hear me okay?
Yes, we can see the mouse, yes.
All right, sorry, my computer just kind of froze real quick. That was really odd, and I might need to restart Unreal because it's like it got stuck on capturing for some reason. Which was super weird. Yeah, Unreal crashed on me. So one moment while I relaunch it. That's not normally what happens when I do the capture, but I've been having some issues with my computer this weekend. So my CPU has been having some fun times. So please pardon me. All right. So what I can show, now I got this back. There we go. I can show you a really quick sample. So this is one that I kind of made earlier with 2 shots. And I believe this is the one that just got done. Yeah. So I did finish it. My computer just had an issue with Unreal. So it's just going to give you a really quick animation that you can then play with to ensure that your animation is rendering out at the appropriate timing that you prefer. So I just wanted to show you a really quick sample of how you can render out using the legacy mode for rendering, before we get into the one that's going to require you to have a third-party software like DaVinci or Nuke or After Effects or whatever compositing tool of your choice is. All right, so now that we've kind of gone through and gotten our renders out of Unreal, or know how to get our renders out of Unreal, or a quick render at least, let's talk about how we can render at different or higher qualities. So we're going to do a quick overview of the post-processing process. So what is post-processing? It's a way in which you can edit and enhance images or video after you initially capture it, okay? So it's going to be, we've already done the lighting in our scene. If you've went through Noah's class and now you know how to do some really nice lighting, you've done your animation. Now we want to edit it a little bit more. We want to make corrections and enhancements. We want to improve the overall visual quality so we can get that aesthetic that we're really looking for, or establish that look and feel for our particular scene. Okay, I want to talk about the importance of color though, okay? Because y'all have seen there's a ton of different types of crayons that you can get out there, all of which might produce a different color, okay? If you have the Crayola crayons, the basic premium crayons, or Imperial, you can tell that the color is going to look little bit different depending on the type that you get. Okay, there's nothing wrong with any of them. We might have our own preferences, but they're all just a little bit different from one another and how they're going to produce color or produce that aesthetic that you're looking for. Some folks might prefer the Imperial aesthetic, some other folks might prefer the basic premium crayon. So, and the same is true for different devices, okay? You have a Fuji camera, you have an Olympus camera, a Canon, a Nikon, or an iPhone versus a Samsung Galaxy. All of them are going to process color in a little bit of a different way. They're all have a different way of just like saying, this is what we believe is red. It's going to be a set number. It's going to then output as that way, okay? So some folks might be camp iPhone in color, some folks are camp Samsung. It doesn't, so but at the end of the day, we need a way to ensure that we can have consistency of our color across these devices, okay? So if someone filmed with a Fuji and they filmed with someone else filmed with a Canon, how are we going to translate that into maybe a single project, okay? So this is where color management comes into play. It's trying to establish that consistent and accurate color representation across the devices. So you're going to create a color profile for different monitors and printers and cameras and other devices to ensure that you have a reliable and consistent color reproduction, all right? So there's two areas that we're really going to talk about today for different types of color management. One is ACES, and the other is sRGB, or standard red, green, blue. Some of you might have heard the term sRGB before because it's very widely used for computer monitors. There also sometimes might hear it interchangeably used with Rec 709 or REC 709, which was developed for HD broadcasting. ACES was developed because it's actually a wider color gamut. It gives you almost the entire amount of colors that are available to the human eye. Okay, it'll map high dynamic range or HDR rendered outputs to low dynamic range LDR displays. And you can use it for a project-wide look. So at the bottom right of this slide over here, you'll see kind of why folks are kind of shifting more towards this ACES color management. Because sRGB and Rec 709 really only gives you a fraction of the amount of colors that are available in the color spectrum, whereas ACES gives you a whole lot more, okay? So just so you're aware, Unreal, the working color space, is defaulting to sRGB or Rec 709, all right? So you do want to be able to determine what your working color space is, and you can, again, set that up from project settings, rendering, and working color space. However, if you do change, so if you changed this color space, ACES CG is one of those options. If you do change this to ACES, you also need to update your viewport and you need to update all of the textures within your scene to be aces, or to at least have that color management or working color space, okay? I'm going to be showing a process where you don't necessarily have to do that, because we're going to be looking at just overall how many different ways you can kind of get a variety of colors because of the different tools we might have to go through in this process of creating our final image. Okay, there's a lot of room for error to kind of lose some of that color information that we really liked in our scene. You spent a lot of time working on this in Unreal, making it look real beautiful. You want to make sure it outputs just as beautiful out of Unreal as it did. You just want to make sure, yeah, it outputs just as beautiful in there. So we start in Unreal. We can start within sRGB Rec 709, and we'll send that to Render Movie Queue. And then it might go out of here. We can shift it into Aces CG, and it'll have the same look and feel. And it can go into either After Effects, it can go into Nuke, or whatever other tool you might want to use. And then again, we can output from here to Aces CG into, this is DaVinci, okay? Again, and you don't necessarily have to go to this compositor or this intermediary. You could just go have one less step, do sRGB to Rec 709 to the Render Movie Queue, and then go to Aces CG into DaVinci. This will be the simplified process I'm going to show you today. And just a quick note, this is a lesson, or this is a fellowship for learning Unreal, so I won't be doing a deep dive into DaVinci or other third-party tools. If you can choose which ones you want to use, it's entirely your preference. But I will be making sure to mention, that's why I wanted to highlight this, is that you really do want to make sure you pay attention of how you're outputting out of Unreal, so that when you're inputting into another tool, that you have those colors be consistent. So there is like an export-import process, all right? So one of these processes that's going to really help us with this is using OpenColor.io, or OCIO, as I'll be referring to it. It is predominantly used between film and virtual production. It's going to help ensure that color preservation throughout the entirety of your pipeline, which it's going to encompass your camera, your compositing, and your final render. And Unreal does support OCIO. We'll be doing this, or setting up an OCIO configuration very shortly. It can help you apply color conversion to different media sources like capture clips or live feeds. It can apply them in your viewport, as I mentioned, because if you wanted to have Aces work, you can use an OCIO conversion to have Aces work in your viewport. You can also have it work in Composure, which is part of Unreal. And also you can apply a color space transformation into your movie render queue. You do need to enable a plugin for this to work. It should be enabled by default for that project scene. If it isn't, we'll take a look at it. But we also then, once it's enabled, we want to go to miscellaneous and grab the OpenCIO or OpenColor configuration node that we will then be developing a configuration that we'll use in Unreal. Okay, so Unreal 5.2.1 comes built with different configs, at least 3 that you can work with. There's a default config, and then an Aces version 1.3 config, and then also a studio config. We'll look at the differences between those in just a second. So again, Unreal is going to be using the sRGB Rec 709 color space by default. So again, if you wanted to convert to a broader color space Aces, you'll need to include it in your desired in here. So this is what we're essentially going to be making, is a open OCIO node that will have these desired color spaces in it. So if you're still a little confused as to what OpenColor.io is, okay, the best way I can define it is it's kind of like a dictionary or a translator for color spaces, okay? So like, just imagine if this was a translator like Google Translate, where it had English and French and Arabic and Russian, and it's going to help. I took this in English, and then it'll output for me in Russian, which is amazing to be able to have this sort of node, to be able to do that sort of translation for us, so we don't have to try to figure out that 1 or 0 or 5 or whatever number for color equals red equals that, whatever that equals in Aces. It's going to do that configuration or do that shift for us. So let's take a look at how we can create an open IO configuration node in Unreal and get that set up real quick. All right, so I have Unreal open over here. Again, this is the intro indoor scene. You can create a folder for this depending on how many configs you want to have. But we're not going to use the config quite yet until we get to the rendering, but it is good to just sort of have one that you can create. And you can use this for however many projects you'd like to use. So I'm going to create a new folder, and we can call this OCIO, just so we can keep it clean for ourselves, especially if this is a folder you might want to reuse in a different project. All right. And then you can right click in here and go to miscellaneous and scroll down until you find open color IO configuration. So if you do not see this, all right, it is likely that you need to go to edit plugins and enable the open color IO or OCIO plugin. So you want to make sure that is checked. If it is not in your scene, this is where you would find it, and you will have to restart Unreal for it to show up in your miscellaneous area. All right. So again, right click, miscellaneous, open color IO configuration. And you can call this whatever you like. I will call this just ACES and sRGB config, because that's what I'm going to be making here. And you'll see why I'm kind of specifying ACES and sRGB with this, because there's actually others that you can use. So when you open this up, it'll look a little like this. And it'll have the configuration file. Unfortunately, I was saying the word fortunately, it does give you a default config to work with. Like I mentioned, Unreal 5.2.1 gives you at least 3 that you can work with. The default is one of them. So we'll just look at what the default has really quickly so you can kind of take a gander at it. So then we want to update the desired color spaces. So it'll have 0.8 elements. So if I hit the plus symbol here, I can add an element. And it's going to say invalid until I hit this drop down. And this drop down will now give you the various color spaces that you could switch between. So ACES is one. And I could just add all of these if I wanted to. And that's what's sort of nice. So why would you want to add more than you need? Because you're not necessarily sure, maybe at this point in the game, which one you want to use. Okay, so it's sometimes just good to have more options to play with so that you can see in post or just in later, whenever you're going to render, which one you might want to end up rendering with. So we'll add ACES CC here, and I could just keep adding more. And under utility, you'll see there's also these linear Rec 20 or Rec 709 sRGB. So that's the one we're going to want right there. Also some for Gamma, another for Gamma 2.2 Rec 709 texture, also sRGB texture and raw. So they give you quite a bit here. This is really all you're going to need if you're rendering just in general. These are the most of the ones that I would use. But if you wanted to look at the different configs, and what they'll have. And this is what I mean by this is like a dictionary or a translator for different types of media. I'm just copying this, the other configs that I included in my slides. So this one right here. This is the next one up. This is the CG config version 1 for ACES version 5.1 or 5.3. I will hit reload and rebuild. Okay. And then I'll hit the plus sign one more time. And so when I look at this, it doesn't really give me that many more options, actually. I think it should have. I might have actually need to hit reload one more time. So I thought there were a little bit more, but maybe not. So it is going to give you a little bit more in here. But the next one actually is the one that I want to show the most, because this one, reload and rebuild, it's going to trash it entirely. And now you'll have some input ones. So if you're bringing in third-party footage or other footage, using ARRI or Blackmagic, or have a Canon camera or Panasonic or a Red or a Sony camera, these are where you can get those inputs. Okay, so this is why I'm saying it's like a dictionary, because it'll have third-party cameras or devices that you can bring in. And there's actually a whole lot more configs that you can look at. So if you wanted to go to the OCIO website, the OpenIO website, they will also have additional configs that you can look at. So that'll tell you how you can translate between these different color spaces. So it even gives you a few more under ACES and a few more under utility. So I'll just kind of start adding a bunch of these in here for ACES, ACES CCT. Again, these are just different color conversions, ACES CG, and then ACES, sure, just going to add all the ACES, and then also making sure that I add the Linear Rec 709 sRGB in here. So once you have this here, you can hit save. That is all you need to do right now. This is, again, a file you can use for whatever project you want. Just getting it made is good to have done so that you can move about the cabin in your scene. All right. Before I check out of Unreal in here, we do want to verify our project settings, because remember, we were looking at those color spaces, or the world color space. So if I just typed in color space in here, you can see working color space. It is set to sRGB Rec 709. But again, you have these other options in here. So if you wanted to shift to the ACES CG or other ACES or a custom color space, you can absolutely do that to start your scene in here. Okay, and it's totally fine if you need to do that now and you've already got a project set, because we haven't output anything yet. So you still have opportunities to make some fixes. All right, cool. So going back to my slides here. Now that we've kind of gotten OCIO and we've talked about it a little bit, and we know what sort of color management system we're going to go to, we want to talk about what color grading is. Some of you have probably heard that term before. Some of you are probably more than familiar with that term. But it's essentially going to be how you'll adjust and enhance the colors or images in your scene. And it's going to be for artistic or visual effects, okay? You're going to rely on consistent color reproduction set by color management to ensure that it's consistent, okay? We're going to use post-process volumes to sort of help us with that, okay? Yes, you could do this in post. You could do your color grading. So you film folks have probably used, done color grading a lot in Final Cut or Premiere or DaVinci or whatever tool you might be using. But we can be doing that in here in our scene to get better color and make our scene look exactly how we're wanting it to look. And we can still do the post after if we wanted to. But let's get it right in here so we can make sure we're outputting it appropriately. So post-process volumes, they do have this color grading section here, which has the temperature, global, and shadows, and also other tone mapping capabilities. Not only that, but you can also do post-processing on a camera. Generally don't recommend doing it on a per camera basis. You generally want to do it global. But if you do have some, I need to have a quick tweak, or you're doing something very unique for a specific camera and want to just have your global scene be as is, you can still go in here and do color grading and adjust a lot of the same settings on a camera itself. And we'll take a look at that real quick when we get back into Unreal. So again, color grading is going to allow you to establish the look and feel. This is just a quick sample of the same scene, which is different color grading to establish a different aesthetic feel for a particular project, okay? I guess heavy, very saturated sunset going to something that's cold. It just changes the overall tone and mood of a scene, okay? And so here's a quick overview of the color grading workflow and how we might get started. So we've set our color management up. We've set up our OCIO config file. Now we need to go in and actually start tweaking our scene, okay? So one of the things, or first things we're going to do, sorry about this, I hit a little scroll wheel on my mouse. We're going to turn off auto exposure in the project settings. Noah mentioned that in the lighting class because absolutely we want to be able to do this in a post-process volume. Then we're going to look at setting the temperature or the white balance of our scene. We can do the tone mapping. Quick example over here under global, some tone mapping we can start doing or adjusting the saturation for color correction. And we can go into color correct or the globals per shot. And we can then adjust some shadows, mids, highs globally if you need to. You might have gotten everything you need just for doing your color temperature and your tone mapping and doing some slight color correction. This may not be absolutely needed. Just like the last step, doing in-camera adjustments may not be needed. Okay, again, not recommended to do the camera adjustments, but you can if you do feel that it's something that's going to help your scene. All right. So what is white balance? It's going to ensure that the white objects appear white and that other colors are rendered correctly without any unwanted color that's getting cast. Okay. So the color temperature as part of this is measured in Kelvin. Noah talked a little bit about this. It's going to be the warmth or coolness of a color. So you can see just here on this Kelvin scale. So if you had 10,000 Kelvin, it's going to get much on the higher on the coolness factor, or down here at 1,000 Kelvin, it's going to be closer to a candle, or 1900 here. So these are just some examples of what you might see if you're going to be adjusting color temperature. This is a great chart to just sort of review. So if you're trying to get a certain feel for a scene, having the color temperature set could be a quicker way to kind of get there. And then tone mapping. So this is going to be, we have slope, toe, shoulder, black, white clip, all fun terms if you've never heard them before, but essentially a slope is going to be this overall S curve. So if you've ever used curves in After Effects or any other tool, y'all should be a little familiar with what this S curve is for. It's going to help essentially adjust the overall contrast of your scene. And the toe is going to adjust those black areas just down here. Okay, so there's a difference between the black clip and the toe, even though they're kind of close together. And then the shoulder is going to be all those white areas of your scene. And the white clip and dark clip is just going to help kind of bring that in a little bit. So if you're not really a big fan for how dark that is, you can start adjusting the black or the white clip to adjust the overall contrast or tone of your scene. Again, we're going to be looking at the look and feel. Okay, that's going to be through color. It's going to be through tone. It's going to be through the different shadows, midtones, and highlights, or some miscellaneous effects that we might want to add into our scene. So a couple tips for rendering before we kind of get back into here. We are going to be rendering some EXRs. And this is not necessarily you have to do this, but it's something I want to mention in case you have some issues with your EXRs in render. The blue correction, this is under the post-process volume under miscellaneous. Sometimes you might get blue artifacts due to the ACES CG color space. So setting this to 0 can help fix that, okay? The same thing with expanding the gamut. It's going to kind of make your saturated tones go beyond the sRGB gamut. So setting this to 0 could help fix some of those issues or some other issues. And this is the one that I would not necessarily have to do, but it's a recommendation if you are having some rendering issues. To modify the tone curve amount, this will essentially deactivate your tone curve, and it's just going to export your or render your file with as if you didn't have any tone mapping or any adjustments on there. So you can also disable this in your movie render queue if you don't want to set this to 0. So I typically render or set this or disable the tone curve in the movie render queue, but you can also disable it here. So I just wanted to make sure this was mentioned because it is sometimes you might have issues when you're rendering with an ACES color space. All right, so let's dive in and take a look at these post-process volumes. It is difficult to say post-process a lot. All right, so first things first, we're going to take a look at turning off this auto exposure. So Noah mentioned it in his class, but the auto exposure kind of can be a little, it can be a lot. As you can kind of see here, it's really blasting out the scene. So if you do have auto exposure turned on, again, you want to make sure you go to your project settings and type in auto exposure and uncheck this, okay? And I'll just kind of, so you can kind of see what it was really doing. You'll see it start to kind of sun up quite a bit. And then as I turn it off, I get a little bit more of a clear scene in here. So that's pretty helpful. Okay, the next thing I'm going to want to do is create that post-process volume. I can do that by going into my little drop down here to get some content and go to volumes and post-process volume. All right. Wonderful. Noah's kind of talked about this beginning of this a little bit. I'll just do a real quick review. So as you are aware, the very first thing that happens when you create a new post-process volume, I believe I actually already have one in here, but so I'll delete this new one. We'll just work off of this one, is you're going to want to make sure that you have infinite extend or the bounds to set to infinite. So why would we have to go in and turn this on? So again, it's infinite, infinite extent on bound. Why do we want to turn that on? Like, why isn't it off by default? So the reason why it's off by default is kind of a fun thing. And it's more related to games, but it can be used in visual effects if you kind of use it a little bit more creatively. So because it is a volume, it's anytime you enter that volume is when things can, the post-process volume will be taking effect. So just for instance, before I check this on, I want to kind of do some changes to settings in here. So let the autosave go real quick. We have the bloom and the exposure. These are the two areas that Noah kind of covered a little bit. I could turn those on, but I want to come down here first to color grading, because this is what we're sort of talking about getting into right now. And under temperature, we have the option of checking on color temperature settings. Okay, it's currently set to white balance. You can turn it to color temperature if you would rather work with the temperature setting here, which is set to 6500, which is going to be a little on the white side. So I'm going to turn this down to, like, say that 1900 that was a candle, and you'll notice nothing happens because it is the infinite extends is unchecked. So I need to be in the volume for it to take effect. So if I was to move my camera and come in, you'll start to see all of a sudden it shifts. So I get a nice little color shift in here. That's really dramatic. And it's also kind of a real nice blend in here, okay, which you can adjust. So in gaming, for instance, they'll use these post-process volumes to sort of change a bit. Like if I'm going from one part of the level to another part of the level, or in this case, if this room had, this doorway was open, and say I wanted this to have a different feeling to it because maybe there's monsters in here or there's something in this room, and I wanted to make it to where it got more dramatic as I entered that space, right? I can have a different post-process volume that is in this room, and I can have another post-process volume that is in the other room that I can then make adjustments to. Alternatively, you could do it the camera route, but what I like about the post-process volume is you get this nice blend in here. And if you're not a fan of that blend, this is all adjustable, kind of coming down here. So under post-process volume settings, it's near the bottom where that infinite extends is. You can disable the volume entirely if you wanted to, but you could also adjust the priority. So again, if you're going to have multiple post-process volumes, they can overlap. So you can say which one should take priority first. So it's more, think of it like if it's a layer, you're going to have one on top of the other. This one's going to be the top layer and this is the bottom layer type of thing. And then the blend radius that we could adjust. So I'm going to see if I can set like that to 1. It kind of just pops on. So you kind of wanted it like 100 or something, maybe like 500. So maybe it's a whole lot more gradual as you enter it. And it also kind of, you notice I'm outside of the volume's right here, but the radius has now gotten so large that it's going to start shifting, or it actually extends outside of the volume a little bit, so that when I enter it, then it'll be its full amount. Okay, so, and you can adjust the weight of the blend if you wanted to. And then again, it's not, when I said it's a 0.1, it almost is like as if it turns it off. So the weight is like the overall intensity. So if you're like, this is a lot, you can tap that down a little bit. So now it's set to 0.5 instead of this very, very saturated 1. I don't really mess with this too much, because if it was too much, then I will go adjust my color grading, but because this will kind of globally adjust everything in that volume. So I mostly change the priority and the blend radius a bit so that I can adjust how I might go in and out of different post-process volumes. All right. But just for this exercise, I will turn on infinite extent unbound so that it'll adjust the entirety of the scene, because I don't have a case for this particular scene where I want to animate going through post-process volumes. So I wanted to make sure y'all were aware of this feature, because it's really cool to mess with if you have the right use case. All right, so we've looked at the different color grading and color temperature here. So again, I'm at the 1900. I can go up to 10,000 because I am working in the Kelvin, or even 15,000. And it's going to start getting a little bit more blue or cold in here as I start increasing this. And you can also adjust the overall tint of it in here. So whatever temperature I choose, it's going to adjust that based off of that tint. Okay, so these two do play with one another. All right. So that's just kind of a little bit of the color temperature. So I'm going to come in, and I want it to be a little bit on the cool side. I did kind of like it at around 10,000. Actually, I want a little bit more. So maybe I can add some tint so I can get a little bit more greenish in there. All right, it's looking cool. And then under global, all right, this is where you can start globally adjusting some of the contrasts and features of your scene. Okay, so we have this saturation. Just open this up down here. Just the overall saturation and make this a lot more saturated. So if I wasn't that happy with the tint and I wanted to kind of make that a little bit more, I could definitely come in here and adjust it, or I can start desaturating it. If you start desaturating things, then your color space isn't going to really matter too much at the end of the day. I mean, it'll matter a little bit for the tones, but you won't, the colors you're not going to be too worried about. So I can start kind of oversaturating some of these colors if I wanted to, and then come down here and start adjusting this contrast. Kind of doing the same thing. I'm going to collapse this to make this a little bit easier for y'all to see. So I tend to like real high contrast. It's just sort of my favorite sorts of looks. And you can, if you're not a fan of the RGB color mode, they do have HSV in here. So again, hue, saturation, and value. So and also luminance is also in here. So if you'd rather just adjust the overall value, which is essentially what I was doing over here, you can make those sort of adjustments. And then we have the gamma, which is the relationship to the luminance of the scene. You can start making some additional boosts in here as needed. I think I'm okay not using gamma for my scene in particular. And if you're not sure, like say you were playing with this too much and you don't remember what the default value is, you can always hit this little arrow button to reset to that particular default value for that one instant. So it won't reset it to everything, which I think is super handy. Then you have the gain, which will just adjust the brightness of your highlights. Okay, so anything that's more on the white area in here, the gain will kind of start boosting those. So you see all my lighter areas are starting to get some boosts from this. Okay, and then offset, which will shift all the colors of the image, either adding or subtracting a fixed amount. So you see it's kind of going all over the place, and it's kind of washing this out a little bit. But you can kind of start negatively affecting all of them a little if you wanted to get a little bit more contrast or boost it a little bit more. So that's sort of what offset will do for you. Okay. So reason I spent a little bit more time going over each of these is because under this section in here, we also have shadows, midtones, and highlights, all of which have the same types of settings. Okay, so you can get real finite in here and how you make your overall adjustments in this post-process volume. Because I can say like, oh, I don't like the saturation of my shadows. Well, you can adjust just the saturation of the shadow diffuse over here. I can make this a lot darker. I want it, because you see how like sort of washed out that looks over here? I can be like, oh, okay, I want that a little bit darker because this is sort of in a darkness. And you can do the same for just the contrast of your shadows. So you can make it go in the opposite direction or a little bit more darkness. So this is only going to adjust just the shadow contrast. Same for offset, gain, and gamma. Okay. And again, for your midtones, those mid colors or literally mid-tone, you can adjust the contrast of those as well, of just those mids. So it's not touching that shadow area that was getting touched over here before. It is now only going to be touching these mid-tone values. All right. So you have a lot of control with this post-process volume of exactly how your scene might look. Again, this is why it's a benefit of doing some of this color grading in the engine versus doing it in your editor, because it's going to allow you to make these changes before you actually output anything and get some really nice looks. So again, just lastly, for this one, your highlights, I'm using contrast because it's a little bit more evident. Maybe not for highlight because I'm already a little blasted in here. I can look at gain because that's going to really boost it a little. Maybe not so much. But you can start making some of these adjustments to just your highlights in particular of your scene, and also adjust the max and min of your highlights if you need to. All right, so that is just some of the color grading features here for just the global shadows, mids, and highlights. Okay. Here's also when I mentioned that MISC value, if you're going to be outputting using the ACCG, where you can adjust the color, the blue correction, if you set that to 0, and the color expand gamut, set that to 0. That'll kind of make you have a little bit cleaner render if you're outputting with ACCG. I'm not going to enable this one because I'm going to just use disable tone curve later on, but I wanted to make sure y'all knew where this was located. All right. Lastly, before we take a quick break, the slope. So we talked about the tone mapping for film. So here's your slope, toe, shoulder, black clip, white clip. This is that S curve we were talking about. So again, you can come in here and start adjusting the overall slope of that S curve. It can brighten, soften some of these. So you don't necessarily, if you're not a fan of what you did in the global section over here for some of your contrasts, you can come back and maybe start here instead. You can also adjust your overall toe, which will adjust that darkness, the lightness of your scene a little bit more. I have a very dark scene. Why couldn't this, I should have made this like look like a very happy style space environment, but here we are. Still have time. You can do the black clip to adjust the overall black. So it's taking what is essentially is clipping it up. So it's shrinking that mid-tone value a little bit more when you start black clip and come up a little bit more, right? Because remember when I was adjusting the mid-tones, it was grabbing all of this. But if I adjust this black clip, it's going to now maybe only adjust stuff in here because this is now more on the black side of things. So, and the same for the white clip, you can start toning that down as well. All right. So all of these are the color grading features that you can mess with in the Unreal Engine. So we're going to take a 10-minute break at around 1:01, I suppose, or 1:02, deciding when Brian wants to come back. But we're going to continue talking about this post-process volume, and then we're going to crank it right up into rendering and take a look at some renders. All right. So as we left, we had just finished looking at doing some of the color grading options within the post-process volume. I did also want to make sure that you looked at some of the film. We did the film, it's down here a bit more. They have film grain, other opportunities if you wanted to have some additional fun times where you can actually create some grain in here. Looks a little fun. You can adjust the overall intensities and shadows of the grain. So for you film grain lovers, there's some fun stuff in here. But also, if you did want to do some lens flares in some scenes, as Noah was showing in the last class, you would need to enable your bloom, but also enable your lens flare in here in order for that to work. So this scene I can kind of get a little bit of it, like you can kind of see like right in there. So if I wanted to adjust that overall intensity of the bloom, I can. And then also adjust the intensity of the lens flare. All right. So those are some additional fun things. Like I could change even the color of it. So if I wanted it to sort of be a red color, I'm not sure why you would in this case, but why not? It looks fun. Those are some additional neat things that you can do in here and adjust the overall size of each of these bokeh in here, and the threshold and the shape. And you can input your own shape as well if you did have one that you wanted to work with for the lens flares. All right. Also some chromatic aberration in here. So that's just if I start adjusting that. And again, if I hovered over some of these, it's just going to change the overall, give you some camera artifacts in post-process. So you can kind of go real intense with this to make it look like some fun times in here, a little trippy. But just wanted to show some additional features that exist on some of these post-process volumes. I'm going to turn off the bloom for myself. You can also add some image effects, which is the vignette, which will start kind of darkening the corners of your scene. It's already a very dark scene, so you're not going to see that as well as I would like. But you can kind of see it starting to fade around the corners like a vignette might. Also adjusting some of this depth of field. I normally don't adjust this on a post-process volume. This is something I say for the camera, But you can adjust it in here if you'd like to. It's going to essentially just start making your scene appear blurry in certain areas. I'll need to adjust some of the focal distance, and this is going to be directly related to whatever camera you might use as well. So I can start getting some of that blur happening in here. If I wanted to only have focus on a specific scene, you can start adjusting some of these settings. Really, really blurry. Okay, so it's going to make it anytime I move, what this will be in focus, this will be out of focus. So again, this is not necessarily something you might want globally, but I wanted to make sure you were aware of what this will do in its existence here. Okay, we've already sort of, Noah kind of covered the exposure a bit. So what I want to kind of look at next, real quickly, is something called a LUT. So a LUT is a lookup table, or it is a set of instructions for remapping pixel values. Okay, it's math. So I know how animators might feel about doing some more complex math functions, but this is actually fairly simple to set up in the Unreal Engine. So this is just step-by-step process of how you can go about doing it. What you see up here on the right, this is what's called a 1D LUT. I'm going to talk about the difference between a 1D and a 3D LUT in a minute. So it essentially, this is a neutral identity LUT, which means that if you were to apply this to your scene, you should see no change to your image or no color change. So LUTs are really great to use in production, especially if you're working with multiple devices, to kind of create an overall look and feel to your scene. So it's similar of what we were doing with color grading, but in this case, I'm using a LUT to do that instead. Okay, so I will go back into Unreal and turn off some of my other color grading that I've done in there so we can see what a LUT will do when I apply it. But essentially, you will need to use Photoshop or some other image editing tool for this. So if you're using GIMP or Corel, whatever you might choose to use, it will work for this. And I'll walk you through the process of getting this up into a post-process volume. There is a LUT section in there for importing your texture, which needs to be imported very specifically as a no map and set the group to color lookup tables. Okay, so those are kind of the two key things we have to make sure we do when we're working with a LUT or a 1D LUT in the Unreal Engine. But there is also 3D LUTs. And so why am I talking about 3D LUTs? Because in the OCIO process, a 1D LUT won't necessarily look the way in which you're going to want it to look. And so a 3D LUT will give you a better color or it'll look better when you're animating, essentially. So in order to create a 3D volume or a 3D LUT, we would have to create a volume texture that will have our 3D LUT on it, and it cannot be the same as this image. So I actually created a neutral 3D LUT image for you using Python to kind of make sure it was a neutral LUT for you to use, and that's in that LUT zip file that's in SmashCut. So if you are wanting to try this out, again, it's not required, it's just showing you some features of post-process volumes. You can go download that on SmashCut. But it will require you to make a volume texture that has that 3D LUT on there, and it needs to be set to 33 by 33 and the X and the Y tile. So this particular image that I generated, it's 1089 by 33, which 1089 divided by 33 is 33 by 30. It's just 33 times 33. So that's why it's a 1089 by 33 file, because when it's all wrapped up, it'll be 3D. So you have to essentially save this volume texture, making sure it is an HDR compression, and then put that on a material and then make a material instance. And so I did all that for you. So that's what that 3D or that LUT zip file has. So it was a lot of math to sort of make some of this on the material, and I'll show you that in a second. But you would just want to place this in your content folder. It's going to have each of these, the identity LUT image that you can use for any future projects you might want to, the 3D volume, the material instance of the material for this, and the 1D LUT. Okay, so I'm gonna go back into here, into Unreal, and turn off some of this stuff so that we can have kind of a base scene. See if what else I turned on in here. don't think that was about it. Yeah. All right. So under this LUT folder, so this is what I provided for you. It should look like this. And again, this is the 3D LUT material. So it's not a ton of math, but it's a little bit of math involved. If you would like to kind of break down and look at this, you're more than welcome to kind of crack this sucker open and take a look at why it's working the way it is. But essentially, it's just sort of converting the scene texture into X, Y, and Z coordinates in here that can later be multiplied and divided out to make it a neutral LUT to the scene. And then I made a material instance that will go on our post-process volume. But first, I want to create a 1D LUT. So to do that, you do want to take a snapshot or a high resolution snapshot of your scene. I'm going to do that by going to the three little things over here, our little hamburger, I guess they're called, and you can hit high resolution screenshot. Okay, this works just not for this, but for everything. So if you just want a screenshot of your scene, high resolution screenshot works really well. And you can choose the multiplier. You can include a date and time or anything else you might need. I just want a single image of it, and then you would hit capture. So I'm not going to hit capture because it should be fine, but I'm nervous about my computer closing, and I already generated this for you for the day. So this should go into Photoshop, which here's the angle I took it at before, okay? And in Photoshop, all you would do is just treat this as if it was any other type of image you wanted to edit, okay? So I can come in here and grab curves and start editing this scene as I see fit. Okay, that's not looking great, but you kind of get the picture here. Whoop. Go away. So start adding some contrast in there. Can add the hue saturation. So if I wanted to make this a little more saturated and maybe colorize it. No, I don't want that. I'm going to do just a photo filter, I think will be nice. Just get some cooling filter and kind of like I was doing before, make it a little bit blue. This is fine. Okay, I might adjust the curves a little bit more, but trying to just get something that is editing the image. And then you can open up that 1D LUT that looks a little like this. All right, and you can group your adjustments together. And I'm just going to copy them and paste them over here and just on top of it. Okay, that's why I did it as an adjustment layer and not on the image itself. And then you would just save this as an EXR. Okay, so I'm actually going to just merge all these together. New file, save as, and you can call this 1D LUT, and I'll just do this like underscore class into my project file. Okay. If you don't have EXR as a save or as ability to save in Photoshop, you will have to download a plugin for that, just FYI. So any other third-party tool that you're using, if it's not Photoshop, would likely need the OpenEXR plugin. Just want to make sure I asterisk that if you can't save as an OpenEXR. And then back in Unreal, you could take this image, okay, and I'm just going to search for, well, it's actually right here. I was going to search for LUT. Okay, I'm going to double click on the image first off, and I want to make sure, actually it's not in here, so I need to import it, would probably be the smart thing to do. LUT for class. All right, and then I'm going to open it up and make sure that it is set to no bitmaps. All right, and that it is set to, texture group is going to be set to, I'm just going to type in color lookup table. Okay, so those two things were the settings. And just say don't. Okay, and you can then drag and drop this on here, and you'll get a little bit of what that looks like in your 3D world now. So that's all the LUT is going to do for you. Okay, it's going to allow you to maybe edit and do things a little bit differently instead of in the image. And also it's great about using a LUT like this. If you have different levels, different project files, we had to edit a lot of like little individual checkboxes and here in the post-process volume. We wouldn't have to do that on that any other level we might be working at. We can just do it as a LUT and then grab that LUT and bring that in and ensure that it'll be consistent from scene to scene. So that's really the benefit you're going to find from using a LUT versus using the regular post-process volume. All right. If you don't want to use it, you do not have to. Again, this is just alternatives for those of you who are familiar with the production or virtual production process and want to see how you do this in Unreal. So the 3D LUT, it's similar, but instead of it going on this miscellaneous section here, it's going to go on what's called a post-process material. Okay, so you'll see this section under rendering features called post-process materials. That's why I created a material instance for this to go on. So I will hit the plus sign, choose asset reference, and then this is where you would grab and drop your material on there. But I haven't made any edits to this identity material yet or texture. You would do the same thing, or you can do the same thing in Photoshop. So I could just very well take this same group and paste it on top of here and save it as class. Okay. And then back in Unreal, import that identity LUT. Okay. Which this identity LUT, again, verify that you're using the color lookup table. All right, and no bitmaps. Okay. And then you would need to create that volume texture I mentioned in that screenshot. So this says the identity LUT on there. I'm going to I'll make this a little smaller. The identity LUT class, drag that on there. It will reset these tile sizes. So I need to make that 33 by 33. So it'll look a little like that. Okay. And then we would hit save. And this volume texture is already associated with the material. So again, you don't have to, if you're going to use this, you just need to make sure you kind of use these material instances. And I would just drag that onto there. And now it's going to kind of make it that blue tone that we were trying to do before, but now in a 3D LUT, and now it'll be a little bit more OCIO compatible. Okay. So those are your main differences between a 1D LUT and a 3D LUT and just how they might get put together. Any of those could sort of work depending on what your use case is. Okay. So finishing up some of the post-process stuff in here. If you're having issues with Lumen and ray tracing, I did want to mention this because Gabby and some other folks are saying that if you don't have a very powerful computer, Lumen and ray tracing could crash your system when you start getting to this phase, because you're going to start upping your settings. You're going to start making things try to look really pretty. You can shift or turn off Lumen and ray tracing. So if you wanted to not render with that, render with something else, you would want to turn that off if you're having some render issues. And alternatively, you can turn it off in the post-process setting, especially if you're having issues with metahumans. The inside of the mouse can look illuminated. So if you switch to ray trace reflections, it could fix some of those issues you might be having. Okay. So just so you're aware where that's located, it's all going to be on the post-process volume here under global illumination. So Lumen, we have the different Lumen settings. So if you wanted to increase your lighting quality, your lighting detail, the final gather quality, as well as the ray tracing settings in here. So you can choose a different type of ray tracing. You can also change the type of reflection. So if you are having reflection issues, this could be where you would make some of those changes. All right. Okay. So we've really examined a lot the different types of things you can do in a post-process volume, but let's start getting some of this stuff out of Unreal and the different ways in which we can do that. So the Movie Render Queue, pretty powerful and pretty awesome. It is a plugin, so you want to make sure it is enabled in your scene. It's a very user-friendly way in which you can integrate the different types of production pipelines that you have in Unreal. Okay, it can export a variety of types of images and also multiple sequences, different output settings. You can render locally or remotely, which is not going to run in the editor. So when you render remotely, you do need to make sure everything in your scene is saved, because it's actually going to take whatever the last save was and render that. I like to think of rendering remotely as equivalent, if you're a Maya user, of if you've ever closed Maya and then right-clicked on your Maya file, you can actually render it with Maya closed. It's just going to render whatever the last thing you saved in your render settings is. So that's kind of the equivalent of what's happening here. You can customize these project-wide or shot by shot. So as you kind of saw in this shot here, you can have all of your shots, all of which can have different settings on them. So if you do have multiples, they each can have different quality settings. Okay. Here is just a quick example of the different types of settings you have. There's a lot of them. That's why I recommend rendering with presets, which we'll show in a minute. Okay. It does support anti-aliasing, different camera shutter control for those of you who are working with motion blur, console variables or CVARs. I did also provide, and I'll cover this in just a minute, a handout in SmashCut for the different types of CVARs you can get. You can thank Gabriel for those. Different game overrides, also high resolution output, so you have tile count, overlapping ratio, and just getting higher quality images, and ray tracing and lumen. And this is just a quick, if you wanted to do a really quick basic render and have it still look fairly nice, these are all the settings you're really going to need. Just that EXR, deferred rendering, anti-aliasing, and the color output. And you have to have the output node. Okay, it's just there, you gotta output something. Okay. And remember we talked about, we created that open IO or the open color IO configuration earlier. This is where we would actually input that. Okay, so we would take in under color output, we're going to say we want to use the OCIO configuration, enable it, and then also put in our source file or that file we created and choose what the transform source is. In this case, as you saw, we are working in sRGB Rec 709. And what we want our transform destination to be, and we want to shift to ACES. So if you remember earlier when I showed you that process of going from sRGB into render movie queue or movie render queue, and then you go into ACES CG, this is what's going to now allow us to do that. And under output, very similar to the legacy render we looked at earlier on, you have the ability to choose where it's going to output, what you want the file name format to be, okay, your output resolution, your custom frame rate, whatever you want to set. You can give frame padding in here as well, so adding additional zeros, and also have a custom frame range. So we'll cover this in a minute. So then once you've got everything set, you just hit that render local or render remote, depending on how you want to render. If you're doing a render farm, this could be an option for you. And then you're going to get your rendered images, and we can take a look at them. So once you have those rendered images and you're starting to go into the third-party tool, this is going to be where you'll see that color conversion happen, or where you're going to make sure that you have the correct inputs coming into this tool. Okay, this is why it's important. So I've given a couple examples here for DaVinci and After Effects. If you're using Nuke, it's going to be a really similar process. There's some tools that may not have OCIO color management engaged yet, or they're calling it something else. Like if you're a Adobe Premiere person, they're using automatic tone mapping in there. So you're going to want to look up how to go in and bring in the ACES pipeline into Premiere if that's something you choose to use. So whatever third-party tool you're choosing to use your compositing at this point, you're just going to want to make sure you look at what that process is for adjusting your color spaces or your color management. Okay, so for DaVinci in here, we'll take a look at, I'll use DaVinci for this class in particular, but how you can have the color science in the ACES version you're working on and what the output transform was. And then the same for After Effects. Okay. Let's render something. Let's take a look at this and let's see what we can get cracking here. All right, so in here, I'm gonna, again, we need a level sequence. I'm gonna use this 2-shot render that I put together. Again, you're only supposed to be rendering 1 shot, I believe, for your exquisite corpse. So I'm just using 2 shots so you can, as an example for things that you can show later on if you're gonna mess with this down the road. And all this 2-shot does is essentially, let me turn that on, just kind of zooms in and cuts, okay? Looks great, right? Something super simple. You are going to ensure your frame rate. I think I have mine at 24. I might shift it to 30, but we'll see. And then I'm going to open up the render queue, but I do want to make sure that, again, it was set to movie scene capture, which I was using previously, so I will switch it to movie render queue. And if you do not see this, again, you need to make sure you are in your plugins movie render queue and have this checked, okay? So now when I click that open, the movie render queue will appear, right? And it will open up with the name of whatever level sequence you have. So you might want to name your level sequences. It's good to just go about doing that. When you open up this, you'll see the two different cameras I have in here, which I called shot 1, shot 2. It could say Cine Camera Actor 1, Cine Camera Actor 2, whatever you named it, and you can edit the various settings in here, or you can choose to not render one or the other shot in here if you'd like. But I'm going to click on the settings over here, and just so also you're aware, they have the movie render pipeline. We'll give it a job name, also a sequence. So if you wanted to switch out the sequence that's in here, you could do that here. And also what map. So if you have multiple levels or multiple maps in here, you could also switch the map for here. And this is the lit intro indoor. All right. So once I hit the unsaved config name for the settings, it'll open up the default render settings, which it always defaults to a JPEG sequence. And I don't want to use a JPEG sequence if you're not familiar, or hopefully you're familiar with some JPEGs, but they are a very compressed file format. It's going to make our colors look really mushy, and it's going to kind of not really take all of the work that we did in sort of the post-process volume and give it to us in the way that we can really do anything with it. So if you want to get rid of one of these settings, you just need to select it and hit delete, and that will remove it from your render settings here. I can hit this plus sign next to setting, or just hit the setting button, and it'll open up the entirety of the list of the different types of settings you can add into the movie render queue. So for now, I'm going to go with the options that I showed you in my slide, which are the very basic, I'm calling it a basic render setting, to kind of just get you started. We have the EXR sequence, 16-bit, which is the one we're going to want to use. Compression and multi-layer, we definitely want to have multi-layer checked if we're going to be rendering some multiple passes a little bit later on. The compression, you can choose what's best for you. PIS will work fine, or NWAA also works totally fine. I'm going to leave it to PIS for now. The other options we're going to want to add are going to be anti-aliasing. Okay, because for anti-aliasing, we're going to want to adjust the sample count. So if you're seeing, anti-aliasing is really what's going to increase the quality overall of your renders. So 1 sample count, it's fine. It'll give you a quick render and let you know where you stand. Okay, I generally like to know where I stand before I max things out. So for now, I'm going to leave this to 1:1, but later on I might increase this to 4:4 or 8:8. You do want to note that the spatial sample count and the temporal sample count are multipliers of one another. So the number of sample here I have is 1 times 1. So if I put in 2 here, it would be 2 times 1. And it does give you a little warning that says it does not, anti-aliasing does not coverage when using an even number of samples. So I would need to disable this if I was to increase the sample count, which you can do fairly easily by just hitting this checkbox too. Or going into your project settings. So it is telling me, oh, okay, now you want to increase this a little bit differently. So I can go like 2:2 or 4:4. So now the number of samples I have is 16, not 4. Okay. So just be aware that these are multipliers of one another when you're starting to do your render. So it's not just I'm doing 2 samples, I'm doing however many times this. Okay. But for now, just for a quick render, we'll do that. And then I'm also going to add the color output, because this is that important one with the OCIO configuration. So we have is enabled checked. If yours looks like this, you just need to open it and hit is enabled. And then open up the color configuration so that we can add our OCIO configuration file that we made earlier. So you can either click this and drag it into your scene, or hit the drop down here and find your config file. Fortunately, it's smart enough to just be like, I only had 1 config file in this whole project, so it'll go ahead and find that for me. And the important bits here are adjusting the transform source and the transform destination. I want to go to transform source, and we know it's going to be our working color space for our scene. So if we are working in ACES, we would choose ACES CG. We are not. We kept our color space to sRGB Rec 709. So I will select linear Rec 709 and sRGB. But I do want to shift this color space to ACES CG. So if you're curious about the differences between these different types of ACES, ACES CG is for 3D. ACES CC, you can kind of use this for color grading later on. So if you did want to do some additional color grading, you can set this to ACES CC. But this is going to essentially be for 3D visualization, is what ACES CG is for. Each of these just have a different formulation and are used for a different use case. And again, the Open Color IO site will have more information about what all of these different color spaces can be used for. I'll do ACES CC for now. Okay, just to kind of, maybe I want to do color grading later. And the last thing I want to look at is this deferred rendering. Okay, for y'all, it's going to look probably something like this, and we can leave everything just default for right now, okay, until we decide what we want to do after we see our initial test render, okay. But we do have the ability to adjust. This particular one is world depth, so we can do some render passes, and we can also do some render layers, and I'm going to cover that in a short bit. But by default, it's always going to need to render this main pass, so you do want to have the main pass checked. So everything else we can leave default, and we just want to check our output settings so that we're sure and aware of where this is going. So you want to check your output directory, and for me, I like to put it under saved movie renders. And here's all, I've already done some test renders, so you'll get to see some of those in a minute. So you can create a new folder if you'd like. You can also ask Unreal to do that, but we'll just call this class basic for now and pop that sucker in there. It will give it by default the sequence name. You could also just delete that if you don't want to do that, and I can call this class basic dot frame number. And you notice as I kind of was starting to type, it will give me some options of other things that it could name it. So if you wanted to put the date in there, you just need to make sure that it's in the curly braces, and it'll include that automatically for you, so you don't have to type in the date in there. All right, go away. So the output resolution, I'll do 1920 by 1080. If you're rendering at a higher resolution, like in the 4K, you would adjust that here. You could also use your custom frame range, because right now it's just going to use the frame range that I've indicated here. And if you hit use custom frame range, or sorry, frame rate, I'm saying range is down there. You could adjust that. And also the frame count, and also the custom playback range. So if you wanted it to be a really quick one and I only want 10 frames, you can set that right there. Okay, with all that done, I can then hit accept and then render local. Because I had a crash earlier, I'm a little nervous to hit render local, but I think it should be okay because this will be a really fast render. So when I hit render, it opened up on my other screen, unfortunately. Let's see if I can drag this over. It should open up the render preview. If at any point you want to stop your render, you just hit escape. But you see, mine went pretty fast. Because again, it was a really basic render. It shouldn't have taken that much time. So once you have that basic render done, you're good to go into your third-party tool. Okay, so in this case, we're going to take a gander at DaVinci. And I already have some stuff in here, just some samples I'm going to show you in a minute. But to bring something into DaVinci, I'm just going to, well, before we even get started, I do want to make sure we cover those project settings. Okay, so for color management, I'm using the color science of ACES CC. Okay, we have ACES CCT, you can do ACES CC. I'm doing ACES 1.3 because if you recall, that was the config file that I was looking at, was the ACES 1.3 config. So that's why I based it off of that one, because they do have ACES 1.03, 0.1, 0.2. So I'm using 0.3, and I'm not going to use the input transform here, and I'll show you why in a minute. And then the output is to Rec 709. Okay, So with that, let's hit cancel. I'm going to bring in my, let me refresh this. Should have class basic. It's going to look a little funky right here. Let's drag it into our project scene, and I'll go to my timeline here. So for right here, you see it looks a little funky. Okay, this is, and if you have that happen, some of this is because I need to adjust this ACES input, and that's why I'm going to adjust this here. And I did this for my scene in particular because I have different renders doing different things, and so I wanted to not have a global change to the input transform for color. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to adjust the other clips. But you could, if you're only planning on using one color space as an import in here, adjust it yourself or have it be global. So I'm going to go ACES input transform and go to ACES CC. And you should notice now that it should look equivalent or close to equivalent of my scene in Unreal. Okay, so these are all my little tests that I'm going to show in a minute. So I can just sort of drag this in here, and now you'll be able to successfully see, like, okay, it's not looking too bad. I'm seeing some jittering kind of happening, and you'll see some of the jaggy edges in there. And that's because I have some low anti-aliasing happening, right? So it's clear that I need to increase the quality a bit in order to get some of the stuff that I really want. I want this to look nice and well done, okay? So just as a couple examples, so I rendered these earlier down here. Just to kind of show you, so I'm gonna hit D on my keyboard to hide this one. This is the same sort of basic render that I did just now, but just with a different color grading. So again, it still has some of that jitteriness you can kind of see in there. It's not like my favorite thing. And then there's also this one where I increased the quality of the render. So I'll show you in just a minute. This one's gonna look a little bit better. You can kind of start seeing I'm getting some better shadows. I'm getting some, it's like I'm getting better ambient occlusion sort of happening in here. I'm just getting better quality overall from adjusting to this high quality particular image. So how do we go about getting this high quality image? Let's take a peek back in Unreal. So to do a high quality image, let me make sure I have this handy for you. We're going to go back to our render settings. And if you wanted to keep these for just, and it always adds that JPEG, you want to be careful about that. The JPEG gets added back in. You can save your config as a preset. If you want to have just like, say, the basic config, that's what I call them. It's just basic render so that you don't have to go through and add all those things again. But let's do the high quality render. So before we kind of get into this, I did want to go back to my slides. There are different render settings that we can do to generally improve that overall quality of our renders. So you can also do render layers and passes so that in post, you could do even more if you really want to. There's also these console variables I mentioned earlier. So if you're having those issues where like I need to up the settings of my reflections or my ray tracing, or I want to have higher shadow quality, but when I put it in there, because what deferred rendering is essentially doing, it's taking what you see in your viewport and that's what it's going to render. Okay, so that's what the whole point is. It's like, this is the viewport, this is the render. But in order for you to get that high quality that you might want, you're going to have to increase it, and your computer may not be able to support it. But a console variable, though, will do that at render time. So if your viewport is having a struggle doing those higher settings, you just put in a console variable for that. And so you don't necessarily have to increase those settings because we'll do it at the render or time of render. Okay. So I did include a sample handout for some console variables that we're going to look at. So just as an example here, here's the console variable list. It's a pretty long list. Again, you could thank Gabriel for some of these. And I'm only going to use a few of them for this example, and I'll show you how they work. All right. But also render passes. So it lets you render different output images as separate passes. So we have detail lighting. Oops, let me go back one. Detail lighting and reflections and unlit. Also, if you're using NDisplay, we can use those third-party devices you can use. So they will all create a different version of your movie, which you can use in post-production. There's also, and you might have seen it when I was showing you the plugin, there's another movie render queue, additional render passes checkbox in the plugins, which will give you object IDs. I saw in the chat earlier, I think for Noah's talk, some folks were wondering about CryptoMats. So enabling this particular plugin will allow you to get an object ID pass, which will then allow you to do some mats within DaVinci or whatever other tool, but that's going to be a whole other process that you're going to have to do. So if you wanted to go about it and render things out as separate, you could use these object ID pass. Here's just a sample of what the detail lighting and lighting only or reflections only look like, these sort of passes, or unlit. Okay, so all of these could be layered and that you can edit in Nuke, After Effects, or Fusion for DaVinci. Couple notes, you could also, as I mentioned, do render passes for Z depth, or they call it world depth in here. So you would want to enable this in the deferred rendering setting. They also have motion blur, which also are motion vectors that you can also enable. And you can also render in layers using stencil clip layers. So layers are not typically or initially just used for helping to like sort of organize your scene, but they can be used to just render out separate things as passes. So if you're those folks who have like, I want to render my character out as a separate render layer, this is how you do it. You would just put your character on a single layer, your background on, you don't actually have to put it on another layer, because guess what? The add default layer will take anything that isn't already in a layer and render it separately. So that's sort of nice. You don't have to go and select single thing in your background and put that on a background layer. The default layer checkbox will keep everything or render everything as a separate layer if you enable this. A couple of quick tips though. If you're using OCIO, you can get a little bit of a halo around your render. So this is actually a little halo that appears. It's a little bit of a ghosting effect when you're rendering in layers. This would be where you might disable the tone curve. It has something to do with that tone curve, where you can now see I have a little bit more of a clean line here of my alpha, where if I was to do this, you would have to adjust your color management settings to sRGB linear so that you would get the color transfer appropriate. And that's why in DaVinci, I didn't have that input color, because I'm going to show you a quick example of that. And finally, you can render multiple cameras. So multiple cameras in here, like the camera setting in particular, has a checkbox to render all cameras, and the shutter timing and overscan percentage. If you're having motion blur and you're wanting to adjust how the blur is set, this would be where you would adjust that. Okay, there's 3 options in there. And you can also adjust, there's a little string in here, as I was showing you, for the output directories and file name format, where if you put the camera name in there, it'll automatically update the name. So you don't have to put a camera name folder. You would just do the string camera underscore name with the little curly brackets around it, so that it would automatically do that for you. But if you forget to do that, Unreal will automatically rename the files for you with the different camera names if you have multiple cameras. All right. So let's look at doing some of these high quality settings really quickly in Unreal, and then we will be done. So one of the things, you wanted to start increasing the quality of this overall. Again, a couple things we're going to want to do is the anti-aliasing, as I mentioned. You're going to want to lift this a bit, okay? And by lift it a bit, we can go 4x4. The one that I showed you, I believe I had it as an 8x8. So it was 64 samples, and I had override anti-aliasing turned on. If you do have motion blur, or you want there to be quite a bit more motion blur, I would recommend rendering, or actually warming up your cameras specifically. So for render, so what this will do is it's going to kind of give you like a little bit of a preview. So like if your character is moving, like as the camera starts, it'll actually give you some warm up at the start, so it'll render appropriately. All right, and you can set how much you'd actually want to render it up for. So once I have that set, the next couple things I can do is on the deferred rendering. I can come in here and say, yes, I want to have the depth map and the motion vector. So when you start adding some of these passes, yes, it will increase your render time a bit. But I want to come here and I could start going into deferred rendering and say detail lighting and lighting. So the more I add, it will increase the render time a bit if I added all of these. And for each of these, I could also enable the depth passes. It's not necessary if you have it already on just one of them. So for these, I could just say I only want just, I just want the pass. I don't want these enabled in here, okay? But if you wanted to go about doing a render layer, which is under stencil clip layers, you do need to create a new layer, okay? So I'm going to just X this out real quick. And under layers, so I already have this open, but you could find it under window layers, okay? So if you don't have that open already, and you can choose any objects you want to add. So if you're used to layers and other 3D DCCs like 3D Max, Cinema 4D, Maya, whatever, you could select those objects you want to add and right click, add selected actors to new layer. And I'll call this foreground. All right, so now I got them on a layer. Pretty straightforward and super, super handy to do if you wanted to try to have like a foreground element that you can mess with, okay? So back in here, again, it added that JPEG sequence, so I want to get rid of that. And because I closed it, it didn't save my config. So you're kind of seeing why, like, oh, I forgot to do a thing, and you come back, oh, I forgot to make a preset for that config. I have to go back and do that again. Yeah, so configs are handy. So if I come in and I'm just going to start adding all these back again. All right, and make sure these are checked. And now that I have this actor layer, I can say actor layer, drop down, foreground, and add default layer because it will render everything that's a background element, okay? I've already done a lot here, and you could save this preset. I'm not ready to close it yet, so I'm going to make sure I have this. I can do 8x8 and say none. Got my color output looking right. All right, so the other things that we can start adding is that console variable. Okay, so these console variables, as I mentioned, I added a handout for you to use. Here's going to be the ones that are going to be pretty handy to use. So if you want to start adding them, you need to kind of come into the console variable, hit the plus sign. And I'm just going to copy and paste some of the ones that I have in a separate text file here. So our depth of field quality, I want to set that to 4. Okay. And let's do motion blur quality. So I'm just going to type this one in so you can see what happens when I hit R period motion, and you'll see here's all the different variables and things you can do with this console variable. So I can do quality of the motion blur, and I'll set that to 4. And let's add another one, and this one will do shadow quality. So R shadow quality, there it is. Let's set that to 5. And lastly, we'll hit R dot, and this one's really handy because it's called screen percentage. So what screen percentage will do is I'm going to have this, you can go from like 125% to 200%. So it's going to render it a little bigger and then kind of crush it down. So your quality will improve just a little bit. So it's going to give you a little bit more packed pixels. It'll look nice. So all of these are just going to, at render time, adjust some of those settings in my render so I don't have to see that in my viewport. Pretty dang handy, all right? And then the other settings, as I mentioned, if you have multiple cameras, you want them to render separate, you can do camera. If you wanted to, anything with like the game override, so this one you can just have on, it will increase everything to the cinematic quality settings in your scene. It's not 100% necessary, but it will give you the high quality shadows and texture streaming if you had some textures that were getting streamed in. And you could also adjust the different types of modes that you might have been working in. So I typically like to have this one just to ensure that I have the cinematic high quality and also the high quality shadows, but not necessarily, not quite, you don't necessarily need it. There's the words. Also high resolution, this is also similar to what that screen percentage is going to do. It's going to allow you to just render things really big and it'll crush it down with that tile count. I'm gonna leave this off for right now. But if I do like these settings in here, so I want to just do a quick verification in here of some of these areas that I want to make sure I have on. So come on down here. If you want to render your passes in layers as well, you can also add that foreground layer in there. You may not want to, but if you're going to, if you're going to have layers, you're probably going to want them on each layer. So I do want to sort of verify that I have that cook in here. There we go. And if you're like, Liz, are you going to render this? No, I'm not going. I'm just showing you some of the settings, because once you're happy with all of the settings that you have here, I would then save this config as a new preset and just call it just high quality. So in case I do close it again, I at least can already have it partially there. Okay. So I can hit accept, and then I would make sure I'm saving this to a different folder, not overwriting my basic folder, so that I can see the differences between the two. And then I would hit render local. Okay, so we got some high quality images. So back over here in DaVinci, that's sort of what I got from here, was just some increased render settings that made my overall scene look a little bit clearer. Okay, I also did one with no tone curve. That was the issue if you had some of that problem with the halo effect that you might see on certain render layers. I did render a basic render with no tone curve, and the only thing that I did was different on this one was when I brought it in. So it was basic, no tone curve, and I did this input here. I did sRGB linear as the input because that's what it came out as, and that's what's going to allow me to keep my colors. Okay, so that was the main difference in there. That's going to be something you might have an issue with. All right. Overall, that's sort of it as far as getting your scenes out of here. So if you do have render layers, you're going to want to be working with Fusion and bringing those in so you can see those different layers. And just as a quick example, I believe I have some render layers in here. You'll see those, all those little details in here under layer. So I can just sort of cut through here and see I did render this one as a foreground and a background. So you'll see this is the default background layer, and then also there's the foreground layer. So it's going to really be dependent on how you want to work with your scene, how you want to get this put together, and how much what do you want to do in post. Okay, but you have ultimate ability to do whatever you'd like. But otherwise, that is it.